The pharmaceutical industry back in the day. I was always very frustrated by the sheer cost and time it takes to convert new science into new medicines to patients. This is an incredibly expensive industry. Much of that expense, much of the reasons we pay so much for drugs, is actually the cost of failure. It's actually because many ideas don't work. So we looked at this and I concluded actually it's very much a information industry actually. And if we think of it that way, we can actually then think about how we can use the latest techniques in information technology, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, then to improve the way we handle the data, to improve the way we think about decision making. In fact, that's what the whole sort of R&D process is in the pharmaceutical industry. It's very much around data and decision making. Excentia then was set up as truly an AI-first company, about how we can change the way the R&D process is conducted, thinking about how AI can be applied truly end-to-end from the whole process of how you design the drug, how you develop it, etc. What we fundamentally see then is that in doing so, creating a more overarching approach to how AI can change the process of R&D, you also potentially can end up with much better drugs as well. It's really about how you can design the right drug and select the right patient for that drug. And overall, we believe actually that can change actually the economics of the industry.
So give us some examples of each of those areas as to how AI, the application of AI, can improve that process.
I'll give you two examples actually. The first one is how AI can help us select the right patient, actually how we can improve patient outcomes. A clinical trial which we published in the Journal of Cancer Discovery just last year. We believe this is the first time that an AI machine learning system had been shown to improve clinical outcomes in oncology. What we had developed was a system where we would take samples from patients with blood cancer, do single cell analysis, and that means actually looking at the individual cells, and then seeing how it would respond to over 100 different types of drugs, far more than you could ever give a patient to trial through. Each of the patients enrolled onto a trial were basically late-stage patients. They'd gone through maybe 5, 6, 7 lines of therapy with very little left to treat them with. What we found then, when we used the AI system to really analyze all the different ways, the different cell types, your cancer cell, your immune cells, your healthy cells would respond, you want to distinguish. You want to find a drug that will kill the cancer cell, but not kill your immune cells. So what we found then, by using the complex biology of this, you needed sort of AI systems to really analyze the single cell details of different drug responses. But in doing so then, we were able then to rank all these drugs and say, for this individual patient, this particular drug is the one you should recommend to prescribe. Truly personalized medicine. The results of our trial was, in the control group, about 15 people, then within about a year, everybody was progressing. Within the group that was treated with drugs recommended by the AI system, about 25% of patients were still progression-free survival after 4 years. And this was actually looking at a whole range of drugs using the existing pharmacopoeia, as it's called, the existing sort of medicine cabinet, to think which particular drug could be useful for them. And we would find things like a drug which had potentially had failed a clinical trial for a particular blood cancer indication actually was the right drug for that patient, because in the clinical trial they weren't necessarily selecting the right patients to do that. That's why often clinical trials fail. It's often due to statistics, how necessarily got the right patients being selected for a trial. So that had what's called an objective response rate of around 55%, a hazard ratio of 0.53. These are excellent statistics for in new medicine even. But this was a new process to help us get the most of even our existing medicine cabinet to help sort of patients live longer and progress in free survival much longer.
So just on that, let's pause on that for a second. In the first evidence session, oral evidence session that we took, one of our witnesses said, "This is not new. This is maths, basically." And isn't what you've described, looking at the effect of a particular drug on a particular patient, what medical research has always done, and you analyse its impact. So what is the difference that AI is?
The difference now is the complexity of biology which we're now analysing. Now when we take looking at individual single cells, not just gross amounts of tumour, looking at the statistics of then hundreds and thousands of individual cells and the distributions of the different responses, We're now also looking at how we integrate all the different omics data, single cell sequencing that's possible, single cell transcriptomics, the single cell phenomics of how we respond, to integrate all of this data and to distinguish between, particularly, is that a cancer cell, and is that an immune cell, and is that a healthy cell, and how we respond differently. That's where sort of computer vision, machine learning become incredibly important in helping us distinguish this out. This is something that it's of a scale which a human sort of pathologist would never be able to sort of explore this.
Right. So that's the point, isn't it? So it's using data that is there, but you're saying that there are limits to the cognitive or computational ability of human individuals, and so the computing power allows more to be seen in the data. Is that
absolutely? And also the relevance of that as well. Many times people would do sort of tests in laboratories on cell lines and mouse models, which actually have very little relevance to human disease. What you find when you can do these kind of detailed analysis, which actually only machine learning is capable of allowing us to do, is that we can truly do it on a personalized approach. We've been talking about personalized medicine for nearly 20 years. What we are starting to see now is the first trials of it truly happening. That is this particular drug for that particular individual at this particular point in time. It's an enabler, and it enables us then to take what would be the intellectual framework that we had for 20 years, but now actually put it into real practice. That's what machine learning is allowing us to do. It's the complexity of the data, which we're now gathering, which we are capable of gathering, as you know from your other investigations into the genome revolution and how cheap it is now potentially to gather genomic data. But the sheer wealth and depth and breadth of that data is beyond, as you said, sort of human cognition to understand how we would analyze it. This is where the machine learning approaches we use actually allow us to do this.
Okay. And just one final one for me, then Stephen has a supplementary question on this. You mentioned that the control group was 15 people. That seems quite a small group. Why so small?
The whole study was over 70 sort of people altogether, First investigational study, actually. We've just set up, just announced yesterday, expanding this trial approach with Charité Hospital in Berlin, taking this further. This was the very first sort of publication of this approach. So what you expect to see now is more trials, further development of this technology as we take it forward. But this technology is not just used for the patient today. It's the second example. We also use this.
Before we go to the second example, Professor Hopkins, let me bring Stephen in, who had, I think, a question on what you've said so far.
Sorry, yes, it was going back to one of the earlier points you made, which was about the use of failed drugs,
yes.
Drugs that had failed previously at trial because perhaps they were too specific to a certain cell type. What do you do with that information once you have it? And does that mean that there is an argument to revisit lots of other drugs that have failed at first trial, second trial stage, because they could potentially be personalised? And the second part of that is there a huge cost involved with this? Because we always assume that personalised medicine is very expensive medicine. Is that the case?
No, I think the higher response rate we can obtain fundamentally creates a much more beneficial economic situation, I think, for healthcare systems and for patients. I said the real cost is the cost of failure, the cost of waste. That's, if you can match the right drug to the right patient, you actually start to reduce that waste for the benefit of patients, for the benefit of society. Yeah. And so what do we see that is, yes, there probably are a number of drugs which have potentially failed because they were in the wrong patient groups, the way they were tested. And the more we can then precisely define which patients should be prescribed a particular drug, then overall we should start to see in time potentially success rates start to improve. This is a key feature then about how you can use this technology I just described, not just potentially to help late-stage cancer patients today, but also to help us design better clinical trials and select better patients for those trials. This is what we're doing with the new drugs, which have been generated by AI, now headed into the clinic, novel medicines, is that we now take the wealth of omics data that has been generated and really help distinguish then between what we believe are very sophisticated sort of biomarkers, as they're called, gene signatures, to say that we believe that that patient group is much more likely to respond than this other patient group. And this goes beyond sort of the first generation of genomic medicine. First generation of genomic medicine, you might be aware of, you might have a particular mutation in a cancer, and you've designed a particular drug for that mutation. But in many cases, even if we target in that particular patient group, you still might only get a 30% response rate. There's something else obviously going on in biology, but beyond just that single mutant. And this is what this more sophisticated approach. But it's only really enabled by the use of machine learning to interrogate and understand the wealth of data that we now are able to generate from patients, etc.
And just a quick follow-up, or clarification perhaps, which is that where there are drugs that previously have failed and therefore not been taken forward, presumably it's in the interests of the companies that developed those to revisit their bank of development research. Are they starting to do that or not? That's why I suppose I'm trying to get to. Has what you've said motivated people to revisit drugs?
Potentially. This is
only potentially
absolutely the cutting edge.
Right.
These results were only published a few months ago, etc. So it is certainly possible. I think any company would want to see that could the money they've invested into the generation of that IP potentially benefit patients. So I believe actually there is a new opportunity to be created around the right matchmaking, so to say, identifying the right drug for the right patient. And this, I believe, fundamentally will help us improve, the odds in the clinic, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Ceci. I think Carol wanted to come in. Is that right?
Just a slight clarification, or if you could help us. If a drug has previously failed a trial, how do you persuade a regulator to allow that to be used again in your trials?
If it's failed for safety, then if one has generated new data showing that it actually is an effective medicine, then it passes through the normal regulatory process as usual. If it is failed for other reasons, such as safety, then it's a very sort of different situation necessarily consider. Here we're talking really about efficacy. Yeah. Does a drug work for patients? Okay. I'm not yet discussing around.
So these aren't drugs that have failed for safety reasons,
no, these would
just
be,
for efficacy?
Yes, exactly. Did the statistics of a trial fail because we didn't find the right people?
That's fine.
Thank you. That's very important clarification. Professor Hopkins, you're going on to describe your second example.
Yes, the second use of AI is around how AI can make the process of creating new medicines much more efficient. You might be aware, obviously, in the public imagination right now, the concept of generative AI, ChatGPT, Wall-E, etc., Midjourney in the artistic department. But actually the use of generative AI in chemistry and drug discovery, Excentia has been developing for nearly a decade now since we first published our research in Nature. And what we see now is that if we work with our expert drug hunters using these generative algorithms basically to help us design molecules towards very specific objectives to make the drugs potentially more safer. This is about precision engineering. You should think of a drug not as a little white tablet, but actually as precision engineer technology. It is the atoms that are arranged in that molecule are the result of potentially billions of other decisions that could have been made about what it could be. And in fact, to reduce that search space down, AI allows us then to search that and reduce it far more efficiently. I'll give you an example. We've now developed about 7 prototype drugs, several of them in patient clinical trials, several of us heading towards clinical trials at what's called in IND enabling studies. And what we see now is that on average, we've made around 90% fewer compounds, on average about 250 compounds per project, compared to around 2,500 compounds that would be usually in the pharmaceutical industry in a sort of drug optimization project. This then has implications for cost, implications for time, but also we believe potentially much more precise molecules being designed as well. So we are now seeing repeatable evidence that the use of computational approaches, AI approaches in drug design can potentially help us create a more efficient drug discovery process. That's what's really exciting about this. And what you do then is to think about combining that kind of generative approach to potentially a more efficient way of drug discovery with the approach I just described a few minutes ago about selecting also the right patient. Mm-hmm. That is what we're trying to do. Bring all those together into a sort of end-to-end process. And that's what I see as multiple benefits of the application of AI then across that whole industry spectrum.
Good, excellent. So it's being more precise about how you can target drugs to people and then to, in drug discovery, to design drugs based on problems that you want to
Absolutely.
address.
It's an information problem of data and decision
I
making.
see. Good. Well, let me turn to my colleagues, starting with Rebecca Long-Bailey and then Erin Bell.
Thank you. You mentioned efficiency in the development of new treatments, and also that there was an emerging evidence base. Obviously, this is a new area of science. But why do you think that the larger pharmaceutical companies have been reassured enough to make a significant bet on AI in this field?
Yes. So when I founded Excentia, when we first did this work, it was well before AI was fashionable. But we had a deep belief that this was the way forward for the industry. I think actually now with the evidence base that's been accumulating, drugs moved on to the clinic, the kind of clinical trial I described earlier called EXALT-1, is now giving the pharmaceutical industry, increased confidence to think about making these investments. And they too are also thinking about investments, not just in research, but across the whole pipeline, particularly in commercial and marketing as well as in R&D. So it is I think a concerted effort of investment. And if you speak to companies like AstraZeneca, GSK in the UK as well, you'll see that they've been hiring quite a number of data scientists and AI scientists as well. I think one advantage that a company like Excentia has is that for us, it's not plan B, it's plan A. In fact, it's our only plan, that we believe that this is the way to reinvent the process. And I think the true advantages of AI is about not just adding it to an existing process, but actually think about how we can reinvent a process. For example, if you think about finance and the use of computers in finance, we didn't actually, put robots into the high street to dish out cash as a bank teller. It completely reinvented a process where now all your phone banking is now done on your mobile phone, etc., via an app. So it's a way then to think about how you might reimagine and re-engineer entire processes. That, I think, is the exciting thing, actually. And that's going to be, I think, some of the interesting competitive interplays between the smaller insurgent companies like Excentia and then the larger companies as well. But important thing to remember that in this ecosystem is a lot of collaboration as well. We collaborate with a large number of big pharma companies like Sanofi, BMS, etc. And that's important. Really, it's about actually each company bringing their different skill sets. Big companies are very good at commercialization, late development. Companies like Excentia, I think, actually are very good at discovery, early development stage.
Thank you. On the issue of data protection, that's a huge concern in the emergence of AI within healthcare. How do you think AI systems can be provided with the data that they need to improve in a way that innovates whilst also maintaining adequate data protection?
I think that question is at the heart, actually, of what this committee is investigating. Particularly in healthcare, we're already in a very well-regulated industry, as it should be. And I think actually we have not only have the regulations of the healthcare, of the ethics of running clinical trials, and also the safety regulations for developing pharmaceuticals, we also, of course, have all the data governance and privacy issues as well that we need to take into account. So we have a myriad of overlapping regulatory frameworks as well to which to work within. What we're trying to do here is to think about how we can make a very expensive industry much more efficient in the long run. And that, I believe, is for the benefit of patients and bringing more and better medicines forward, and also for the benefit of healthcare systems and governments ultimately as well. So I think one of the things to consider then is how in the UK can we make advances that AI is seen potentially as an enabler for the benefit of society. And the risk is actually not applying AI in these places, I believe, rather than applying it. So I think actually you already have a very strong framework in terms of data governance and confidentiality and ethics frameworks within those multiple regulatory frameworks I described. But at the same time, the UK has also been an amazing place for generating data. In what we've done with our sequencing initiatives, what we've done with UK Biobank, these have been world leading in providing large data environments actually that can attract innovation to the UK as well.
One of the concerns, of course, is that even if you try to regulate data, as we do here in the UK, and you remove names and details from records that you're using as part of a data set, certain indicators might still point to a particular individual, whether it was the date that they had a heart attack on, for example, and that would flag them up and breach their data, essentially. How would you try to overcome those sorts of data protection breaches?
Oh, that's That's beyond, sort of, I would say, the area of expertise for myself, actually. So I will answer how I think about the systems. I think it is entirely possible to think about in the use and ethics of the data that we generate, in particularly as you think about NHS hospital data going forward. And there have been a number of initiatives actually are trying to do this in an ethical fashion, actually. And I think they actually are to be supported. And I think actually to get the framework right for that, and actually think about it in terms of not just sort of a piecemeal approach about small individual companies maybe taking a few hospital trusts using their data, but actually consider it as a national strategy. It is actually one of the huge potential data resources that the UK have. You know, it's equivalent to almost oil in the Saudi desert, but you still need to mine it to get drill it out to get the value. And in fact, the unified healthcare system we have in the UK and the data records actually could go with it is actually potentially of huge value to the UK as well. So if you can therefore think of a right regulatory framework that would allow you to be comfortable with that and think about it as a national strategy, seeing this as a key data resource actually, I think this is a very important sort of potential source of wealth for the UK, because it can act potentially as a honeypot then for innovation and to attract companies to the UK to use the data.
One other issue that's certainly of concern is bias in data sets. How would your company try to overcome bias?
So in the data sets we're looking at, which is particularly looking at individual patients, the bias we think of is, are we making sure that we can truly understand that this particular sample of cancer we have is representative of your entire cancer? So we think of bias in a very, very different way, very individualized. In terms of societal bias, such as you're alluding to, the key there is to think about how we create sort of larger data sets and actually then make sure that we are sampling across the entire population correctly. Make sure that underrepresented groups are included actually in the healthcare records and how we exploit it. That's a really key important thing. There are ways actually potentially then of designing those systems to incorporate and understand bias. One of the key things we deal with is the fact that drug discovery is both a big data problem but also a small data problem. Actually, we know very little sometimes about starting things, and therefore techniques, what we call active learning, have been vital. The question is asking ourselves, what bit of data should you collect next to actually improve your models? And active learning techniques actually could be one way to think about how you understand the bias in your models and actually then deliberately to go out to seek particular data sets to improve your model in a certain way.
Final question is on transparency. Can the AI systems used by businesses like yours ever be fully transparent and explainable, or are they by definition black boxes?
No, they're not by definition black boxes. It depends entirely on the architecture one is building the systems upon. We ourselves like to really understand the provenance of understanding a prediction. So when now chemists are looking at a design and say, why is it suggested, we design a molecule in a particular way, we can trace that back then to saying, because actually data set says that actually for this particular target or this particular side effect, to avoid it, you have this design. So that actually explainability, as you would call it, connecting the dots between a prediction and the data that led to a prediction, I think is vitally important for understanding in science as much as it is for the general public. It is not inherent that any AI systems are unexplainable. I think actually it depends entirely on a specific architecture. And I think if explainability is a key part of the solution that you want, you need to take that architectural concerns into account in the design of a system right from the start.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just on that point, you started your evidence by saying that the purpose for the deployment of AI was that things were beyond the computational, indeed the cognitive power of individuals. But you've just said there that actually everything, you want everything to be explainable, you want to see those connections. Surely there's a tension between those
No,
two
it's not. It's the size of a space. For example, there are potentially billions of decision trees one could create, in a generative system to understand where we could go. Whittling those down then to find out this is the solution that we now have prioritized and decided. This is the molecule we now want to make that's been generated. But then understanding about where individual predictions come from, why is it score highly in individual models, can be then traced back. So it's a case of the sheer scale of the approach and decisions and the amount of data which we're ingesting is beyond, I would say, human cognition. But actually, once we then sort of come to a solution that we want to find, then tracing it back actually then is a much smaller problem potentially to then understand. And so, yes, you could say, yes, I can see that insight, I can see where it's connected. But actually, that is effectively the needle in the haystack between everything else that you could have got lost in.
But is it not the case that with some medicines, actually, we don't know why they work, how they work? We know they do, and they proceed without an explanation, having been tested for safety and all the rest of the things. So you're setting a higher threshold than actually is the case for kind of many drugs that we've used for a long time.
In fact, what I described earlier, the XL1 trial, embraces what you just said. It's actually saying what we're looking for at the cellular level is the effect. We're not saying how it works, or we just want to say, does this drug work for you? That is the question we're asking. We're not asking yet why it works for you. That we can then start to work out by integration of all of the other types of omics data, and that sort of back propagation to understand that is exactly what we're doing to find new drug targets, to find out, is there a new drug target we could go after from that result from your sort of test?
So it's not a requirement to explain it. It's
no, it's not a requirement
to isolate the...
absolutely. For a drug to be approved, it doesn't necessarily need to know how it works. Yeah. What we need to show is the evidence that it works.
I understand. Thank you. Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. You've said it yourself, in quotes, we need to change the way drugs are invented. Have you got there yet, or are you still on that journey?
It's a continuous journey, because what you want to do is that you never stop trying to improve your processes. I think what we have got now is the first examples where the use of these machine learning techniques with our sort of expert drug hunters is starting to show now that we are producing, I think, precision engineered molecules in a way that is, I think, far more efficient than traditionally has been the case. And we will continue to do that. We continue to develop our systems. Where Exentia's got to now is asking the question, how do we scale? How do we then take what is potentially at the vanguard of this sort of technology and ask a question, how would all drugs be invented this way? So where we are now as a company now is in the period of scaling the company, scaling the technology then to apply to many, many more projects.
You described earlier how you were looking at a tenth of the number of compounds as before, 250 to 2,500. How much have you learned from Google's AlphaFold and what they did with proteins? Is that relevant to what you're doing? Is yours more about chemical compounds rather than proteins? I appreciate they're all chemicals, but is that learning that you've absorbed into what you do?
Yes, it's part of what we do. We think of it as an end-to-end process. That's a particular solution to one particular important problem. We've already been incorporating that technology into our early stage approaches, actually. But also taking some of the learnings of that, actually, and applying it to other technologies and techniques. For example, how could we take that kind of artificial intelligence framework and actually can we apply it and develop it to be faster against things like how you design antibody drugs using that kind of approach of AI. And that's where we are now working as well as a company. We want to now think about how you can design antibodies using AI as well as design small molecules.
Thank you. And do you think we'll eventually have a drug designed entirely by AI, or is this always going to be the AI is there to shrink the space and then hand it over to the more traditional approach? Or do you think we could get to a situation where literally the whole thing is handled by AI from start to finish?
Eventually, I believe that's theoretically possible. But at the moment, it is incredibly vital, the interplay, and this is important for all of the industries that develop in AI, the interplay between the human and the systems. A good example of this is of the observations of Garry Kasparov, actually, in how AI has been used in chess over the past decade, etc., or 2 decades nearly now. It was called Centaur chess, actually. And what he really found is that those systems could make the average chess player much more proficient. Games could become tactically flawless. You could then have an average player or master, start to outcompete a grandmaster, even if you're both using algorithms, because they use in different applications and systems. So the real advantage comes from the combination of human skills and human creativity with the compute power of AI and integrated into new processes. So it's humans plus machine plus process is actually what is the key thing you need to think about if you want to revolutionize the industry.
You said it would be theoretically possible and it might happen that it would be purely AI. What sort of date would we be talking about on that if it was possible? Is it in the next 10 years or the next 20 or the next 50?
In terms of drugs which are moving forward to a clinic, which have either had generative AI systems involved in their design very closely, that's already happening today.
Yes.
And of course we still have human experts guiding and driving the process. Human drug hunter knows what they want. They know what good looks like, so to say. I don't want to put a date on it yet,
Nope.
but what I would say is that it is an active mission of Excentia. Our mission is to solve drug discovery. Mm-hmm. And I believe if you follow this logically through, follow the strategies through, it's entirely possible to do it.
Thank you. Frank Nestle, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at Sanofi, who
Yes.
you'll know obviously, has said the use of AI in medical research is reliant on computer power, algorithms and data, and that the, quote, biggest need for improvement relates to data. Do you agree with that? What are the shortcomings of the data at the moment and how are they being addressed?
I think there is still a lot to be done in terms of algorithms, particularly referring to your last question. As we particularly move up levels of thinking of particularly how you incorporate human creativity and human strategy into processes. This is the real value add that human drug discoverers bring. In terms of data, that's why we as a company, 40% of our staff we employ are experimental biologists in a laboratory generating data. Mm-hmm. You need to have high quality data to generate your algorithms. That's why sort of large data generation initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, UK Biobank, Genome England, etc., are incredibly important, national assets potentially in this space. And where we are focusing our data generation is working with hospitals, working with clinicians, gathering those cancer samples, because with the wealth of information then that can be discovered within that is incredible. Every time we invent a new technology, every time we invent a new kind of omics, allows us to have a new insight then into that biology. But that omics by itself is not enough. You want to integrate it with all the other data that you also could generate. This is why, for us as a company, the ability then to consider how you can access patient samples and then develop sort of machine learning, deep learning driven analysis of those samples, I believe actually this is where the key advances will come in personalised medicine.
You just talked about the importance of wide repositories of data that you and other firms can rely on. Presumably you generate a lot of your own data whilst doing the work. Is that all proprietary or do you have mechanisms for sharing that and making it openly available?
No, for that proprietary information and for many of the arrangements we have, ethical frameworks we work with various hospitals, that is as it has to be as well actually. There are potentially opportunities as well of thinking of how do you gather this data on a national basis, actually. Potentially, again, this could be an important role for the NHS, actually. There's data beyond even the electronic health records that have been talked about earlier, in terms of how we think about pathology, biopsies, etc., could be digitalized and start to be provided into a framework. Huge amount of wealth to the benefit of the individual patients that could be generated there.
We discussed this in a previous inquiry that the NHS is a huge resource for firms like yours. What's the fair price for you to pay to the NHS for the data that they have?
I can't really give a comment on that. We'll have to sit down and work it out as we do. But the main thing we work it out, for example, yesterday we announced a research collaboration with one of the biggest cancer hospitals in Germany called Charité. There is a two-way relationship. It's not about money. It's about how do you bring the data and the technologies back to the patients. Mm-hmm. That's what physicians really want. They want the data to understand how do they treat their patients. And so we actually see it as a two-way relationship, actually.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Carol Monaghan, then finally Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you very much, Professor Hopkins. It's very interesting. Can I ask, who are your current customers?
So our current customers are everyone from the large pharma companies, people like Sanofi, BMS, small biotechs, academic groups as well we are working with, and of course ourselves.
And when you're doing this research, you've talked a lot about the ability, the capacity of AI to look at all the different options and I think you used the phrase needle in the haystack. Would you consider then the AI as an augmentation tool, or will it ultimately remove humans from drug research?
Right now, it is a tool used by humans. Humans really understand the strategy we want to follow, and as I said, know what good looks like in terms of developing a drug. We are thinking and exploring of how actually you bring much more a strategic level into the long-term sort of development of these technologies. It's not about replacing humans. It's about how do we make people more productive.
And so, I mean, it's not about replacing humans, but if your company does drug research so much better than a whole pile of humans who are working in the same field, surely ultimately it will replace humans.
If we ever got to that point, the other benefit to society, of course, would be potentially many more medicines being available to people. It would potentially be, we then started to create a healthier workforce. We then have other economic benefits to the patient and society, potentially the impact on healthcare costs as well. So I think the long-term benefits of taking a inefficient and costly approach to creating sort of, I think, vital medicines is actually in society's benefit in the long term if we can do that.
So what are the risks to replacing the inefficient and costly humans?
It's not about replacing the humans, as I said. It's about how do you make your drug discovery scientists more productive. For example, you could be a drug discovery scientist in a large pharmaceutical company. You could spend your entire career working on projects and never see any one of those ever become a drug go into market. Because even if you get a drug to the clinic, 19 out of 20 of them will still fail. Those failures also mean that patients are being exposed to those tests. Their hopes are being brought up, they're being exposed to new medicines, which you don't know yet all the risks exposed to, etc. So there's a huge sort of...
That would still be the case with drugs that you would
potentially,
be
but if we also think about how the personalised medicine and precision medicine starts to then sort of develop, hopefully then you also start to see sort of increased response rates as well within trials in time. So if you think about then, I consider sort of that to be a waste. What we want, and what I'm really pleased at when I say I was a drug discovery scientist working at Excentia, is that within a short period of time, people in their careers now are seeing drugs come into the clinic, moving forward, etc. And so that's an important element as well. It's how do we ultimately take all of the investment we've made into education, into science, and increase our ability to translate the billions of pounds of investment we make in basic research ultimately into more new medicines for a patient. The NIH did a study of sort of the translation of basic research funded by the NIH into new medicines. It can take sometimes, 25, sometimes up to 40 years before that sort of basic research, when it's first published, actually becomes of benefit to society in terms of a new medicine. Ultimately, what we want to do with these systems is how can we improve the odds of doing that and reduce the time.
All of that I get. Yeah. I'm trying to understand where the human oversight is and where a human working for your company is.
Yes.
What is their role now? Because they're not going to be in the lab doing all these tests.
Today, as it stands, they are running the projects. They are making the final decisions on everything. They are defining the strategy. It's still very much a human-driven process with enhancements by new computational techniques to try to improve efficiencies. What you're describing is potentially some future world, which potentially we may end up in. But if we ever get to that point, then I think the other benefits to society would already have been proving themselves in that industry.
So to get to that future world, government has to play a role in the regulation. So, what would be the key considerations for government at the moment if we're looking at the regulation of AI in drug development, for example?
Sure. We already have multiple layers of regulation, which have been well thought through. For example, whether it's the safety regulations we have for medicines, whether it's the ethical regulations we have for clinical trials, whether it's the privacy and confidentiality regulations we have on data governance. All of these come into play.
So there's nothing new is required if we're looking at AI in medical research?
No, I think the risk is actually potentially to over-regulate a new industry before we've actually worked out actually how we actually are going to apply AI.
I think that would cause some nervousness for a lot of people that you're talking about over-regulation, and I think for many people, and there's got to be public confidence and buy-in for many people, knowing that this had some sort of oversight would give people more confidence, more assurance that the process was going to be working in their best interest. So I'm just wondering, in order to get to that place, what should the government, you've said you shouldn't over-regulate, but there must be some areas that should be considered.
In areas where decisions are being made automatically, particularly if that would affect someone's outcomes, then absolutely I think there are potentially frameworks to understand about how those decisions potentially being made. Are they being made automatically, or are they being made?
Would that need to know how the AI tool was operating?
No, it doesn't need to do. I think that's more of a case of oversight. I think that's where the question relies. For example, the EXALT-1 trial I described earlier. The EXALT-1 trial was recommending which potential medicine a patient should take. It's not actually prescribing. The actual prescription decision is still made by the physician, looking at all the data that's been generated and say, this is why, look at this data, we believe that potentially this medicine might give a better response than this other medicine. So that's fundamentally the physician's decision then to make that. They are responsible for the oversight. The systems we're talking about here are ultimately about how do we bring better information and recommendations based on that information to the responsible parties, so to say. But it's still, I think, in that responsible parties, interests, and they fundamentally must be responsible as well for that decision, as it is today. So it's about fundamentally how do we provide new information. So in that sense, I don't see AI as a revolutionary force. I think actually it fits within the exactly societal frameworks we have today. What it is just a new approach actually of how potentially we can be more efficient in the use of data, which is now, and that's why I meant the risk is actually not applying AI in many cases. Because the risk is actually business as usual, which we know in many cases is inefficiency, is cost, not just to the healthcare provider, but also to the patient as well. So I think we also need to look at the advantages as well that could come, and understanding if we don't embrace the possibility now of better decision making, better information, that we are making a choice to also lock ourselves into today's framework. And if we're happy with the way healthcare systems run today, that's fine. I'm not.
Okay, so changing tack slightly then, you're obviously running a successful company using AI in the research. What are the advantages of the UK regulatory environment over other jurisdictions? And are there any less advantageous aspects of the UK's environment at the moment?
That's a really good question. I think the UK has led the world actually in thinking about, I think, some sensible frameworks, as I said, within data governance, within safety of medicines, within ethics, etc. I think it's a well thought out approaches actually. The UK is also a leader in how we think about the use of AI in healthcare and AI generally actually. We have been, to coin a phrase, punching above our weight, I think, in the early development of this new technology. We're not necessarily putting in as much investment from both a private sector and a public sector into where this potentially could go. But it is interesting, if you look at ourselves, Benevolent AI and others, actually it was UK companies who was actually some of the first into this whole area. And I think that reflects the environment that the UK has had in terms of both the academic backgrounds of producing investment into AI, but also the data backgrounds as well, as we provided earlier. The UK has been actually fantastic in creating large data assets. All of this creates the right environment, the right ecosystem for then sort of these initiatives then to flourish. What the UK needs to think about is we have a very, very strong life science sector at the moment in terms of sort of public investment and in terms of early stage biotechs. It is maybe certain pressures right now in terms of sort of cost of drugs, pharmaceutical market. The UK is probably less attractive to many sort of international companies from that point of view. So we don't necessarily play to being an attractive market from the point of sort of selling drugs. We, however, can be an attractive market as a place to do research. And that, I think, is where the UK strengths could be. And that's why I think having the right governance framework is important to encourage research, encourage new ways of how things could be done, and also think about how large data assets, as we mentioned earlier, could be an important part then of attracting research to us. I think there's lots, it's beyond this committee and it's beyond me to comment about how we think about drug price and things like that. I'm not going to talk about that. But I do think actually we can control and we are in a very good position in the supply side of things. How we supply researchers for our education system, how we supply the possibility of large data assets for academic and NHS.
But funding, you've said, is problematic or challenging.
That is not necessarily a government funding possibility. That is much more of a comment, I would say.
Where would fund research better? I mean, are we talking US, Germany, these kind of places?
So we listed on the NASDAQ in October 21. The reason we listed on the NASDAQ and rather than the London Stock Exchange is because fundamentally capital is much more fluid to attract in the US. We have an incredibly international investor base. From Novo in Denmark to SoftBank in Japan to Baillie Gifford in Scotland to many large US funds as well. And so what we found then is that the stories that we can create in the UK are attractive internationally actually. But what was hard actually is that we built the company, if I would say, despite being in the UK. You know, it wasn't the support of UK investors that built Excentia, it was the support of international investors. So the issue isn't necessarily around government financing in the UK or government funding. The bigger issue for developing AI as an industry is actually that point between the startup and the IPO and about how one attracts international capital into the UK market.
Thank you. My final question is about about regulations. You talked about the requirement to have decent regulations. I can't quite remember your exact words, but do we have sufficient capacity to develop proper regulations? Is there sufficient expertise in this area?
That is a really good question. Yes. I'll be very brief. That's a really good question because what you do need to understand the individual domains. AI being applied in each different industry is going to require actually a different framework. The way to approach it actually probably more generally is to think about what are the key societal issues one wants to address. Issues of privacy, issue potentially around decision making and agency and autonomy being taken away and who is responsible for decisions. I think probably that's a better position to start from because individual regulation is going to be down to each of the individual specific industries that actually are sort of being represented and probably presenting evidence to you. Those are very specific, but I think actually there are some very more general worries and I think they actually are probably sitting closer to the area of how we've thought about data governance in terms of privacy and confidentiality and actually the governance frameworks we put in place for data.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Metcalfe finally, and if we could keep things as concise as possible, we'll get on to the next panel.
My best, Chairman. Following on from that, just briefly, are there any international examples that we should either look at to improve our system or avoid to make sure that we don't fall into the same traps?
Good question. I think this field is still so early, but no one yet has made two bad decisions or two good decisions. And that's the important thing to remember. We are still innovating, we're still evolving. This field is only just now sort of breaking open. We need to understand how we can apply AI in lots of different kinds of industry. So I think the key advantages, and this was interesting about the national strategy that was proposed last year as well, it really is about fundamentally as well how we can help many companies start to adopt AI. I fundamentally believe the companies of the future will be AI first companies. and those which don't think like that will actually be left behind.
Okay. And therefore, if no one's quite got it wrong or right completely yet, do you think that regulation, there should be a sort of a harmonisation, a coordination globally, or is there a competitive edge to be had from diversification of regulation?
You could argue for both. But considering, for example, many systems obviously are transnational by definition, the internet is.
Yeah.
Then if there are particular issues, around privacy, around agency, particularly probably in more of the social general public areas, then there is actually a strong argument for thinking about what would be the approach that one would take on a sort of multinational level to approach that. Because otherwise, you can use a website from anywhere in the world, for example. Yeah. However, in terms of thinking about specific industry applications, where you want to make industry more dynamic and more efficient, then I think there is potentially a competitive advantage there. And that's also potentially connecting it to other investments and other strategies which a national government can undertake, such as we talked about earlier about the investments the UK has made into large data generation, about the potential assets we have with the NHS data and the patient material there.
Perfect, thank you. And final question, Chair, which is around the government is about to publish a white paper on AI. Anything you'd like to see in it? This is your chance to bid, and have you as a sector been consulted on that?
I don't think we've been consulted as much as we should have been, actually. I feel like, it's wonderful to present to you today, but we haven't as deep discussions as I believe we could have. I believe the UK has a particular advantage it could make in terms of the interaction of AI in healthcare. And I would like to see probably within that paper an approach about how we think about the elements of data generation as a key part of it. Ultimately, AI is driven by quality data, and we need to think about our data assets as a key part of our strategy.
I said that was my last question. Can I just clarify? So, am I right in therefore saying that what you're saying, as we move forward, very early in any process, is to think about how data, if data is going to be generated or gathered as part of any process, how we might make that accessible to the AI sector more widely, so
absolutely
build that in at an early
absolutely.
stage.
You need to think up front around confidentiality, around ethics issues, right from the start.
As opposed to trying to do that backwards
absolutely.
with existing data. Perfect. Thank you, Chair.
John Butler wanted to do a supplementary. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. If I had a company and I used quantum computing, would I put your company out of business?
No.
Why not?
Firstly, we are developing quantum techniques alongside AI. We believe the future is the integration of AI with physics-based techniques, actually. Secondly, what's interesting about sort of creative AI is how one really thinks about the interaction between the human elements, understanding human creativity, and how ultimately does one encode that. This is beyond just a simple algorithm. It's actually about a whole ecosystem of algorithms and how they interact. The mission of Excentia is to encode and automate drug discovery. And that means ultimately understanding the human creative element of it as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Among many interesting things you said, Professor Hopkins, one was that people in the pharmaceutical industry could, in the research side, could go through their whole career without having a drug that actually works with patients. And we have heard evidence, we've had evidence of this inquiry, that 86% of drug development programs between 2000 and 2015 were unsuccessful. You had a long career with Pfizer. Did you find that in terms of attracting people to make careers in pharmaceuticals, that was becoming a problem? People were literally committing their life to something that didn't come up with anything beneficial.
What's fascinating is that the people I know who work in the biotech, pharma industry, and the life science academic world as well, really are committed to this space. Many of them could probably earn higher salaries elsewhere, etc. But it's really driven by a mission, actually. People are really dedicated to want to see their skills, their knowledge, the science they do, really apply to creation of new medicines. I think it's very much a sort of mission-driven sort of vocation, actually.
But outside that, did you experience that people were being put off from going into a sector once it entered a phase of much less certain success? in terms of the clinical
Well,
outcomes?
people was potentially being put off by the fact that this lack of success, as you call it, the economic implications, as you might remember, did lead to a very significant number of job losses in the UK in the pharmaceutical industry. We had many, many large research sites closed down, and many of the companies sort of moved back to the US. So the impact has been actually a reduction in the pharmaceutical industry in the UK over the past 20 years.
I see.
This is fundamentally what I'd like to change.
So if AI is successful in drug discovery, its economic impacts can be transformational.
I fundamentally believe this is the next phase of the pharmaceutical industry, actually.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Hopkins. You've been very generous with your time, and we've gleaned a lot of very useful information from that. Can I ask our next panel of witnesses to join us here at the table? As they take their seats, I will introduce them, and they are Professor Delmiro Fernandez-Reyes. Professor Fernandez-Reyes is Professor of Biomedical Computing at University College London and is also Adjunct Professor in Paediatrics at the College of Medicine of the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And the professor is also a medical doctor and has pioneered the use of machine learning approaches to further understanding childhood malaria, amongst other things. Welcome alongside him Professor Michela van der Schaar, who is Professor of Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence and Medicine and Director of the Cambridge Centre for AI in Medicine and is a Professor at the Cambridge University. And Professor van der Schaar's main research areas are the application of AI and machine learning to medical and healthcare challenges, obviously very relevant to our inquiry today. And she's also a Turing Faculty Fellow at the Turing Institute, many affiliations. Thank you very much indeed for coming and giving evidence today. Perhaps I could start off with Professor van der Schaar. You were a member, I think, of the Topple review that was commissioned in 2017 by our colleague Jeremy Hunt in his capacity then as the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. It published a report in 2019 and it was looking at technologies in health and medicine. There was a panel looking from 2017 into the impact of AI, and you co-chaired that panel, I think. Could you perhaps reflect on what you thought then and how things have been since then? Because, as we know, you reported in 2019, but 3 and a bit years is a long time in the development of AI.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I have co-chaired that. So, just for context, the Topple review had 3 different strands. One was genomics, one was digital medicine, and the one that I co-chaired was indeed related to AI. And I would say that the pandemic somewhat indirectly helped in the digital medicine aspect of the panel, because all the clinicians were using technologies to really serve their patients at a much faster pace than anticipated. In AI, I would say some progress has been made. So the Health Education England has instantiated last year 10 fellowships for clinicians that are part-time learning and developing technologies in AI. I would say that, and 10 new clinicians will be enrolled in this program this year. I would say 20 clinicians so far is relatively a modest number. Of course, the pandemic in this case has hurt. What I really wish to see, what I would have hoped to see, is much more involvement with AI in the clinical space. And again, I personally do not want to turn clinicians into machine learners, but I really would have hoped that they would understand these technologies a lot better, not only to adopt them, but to shape them. So what I really was very passionate in that particular report was for the clinicians not only to be at the receiving end of these technologies, but to be much more involved in developing these technologies and providing the right way of thinking about what we really need.
Thank you. And was it your thought, and perhaps is it your thought, that AI would go from being a narrow and rather specialised field to being mainstreamed was the word that was used in the past, that it spread across the sector, or would you expect an expertise to be retained within specialists, but they would become more influential as an expert group?
So first I see AI purely as a tool, not only in medicine, but in transportation, in finance, in businesses, in many domains. And I myself have worked in many areas prior to falling in love with the area of medicine. So I think this technology is really something that can empower many domains. But I do think that currently too much is pushed by people like me in machine learning, imposing these technologies on others, rather than educate them about this and allowing them to develop these technologies. So I see this more or less as a tool that, for instance, in this case, clinicians could shape such that they develop tools that are useful for them. And in that regard, it is important that they are aware about both the possibilities as well as the dangers of the technology, such that the right tools are built rather than pushed onto.
Indeed. Finally, for me, before I turn to Christian Wakeford, in your strand of the Topol review, in reporting in 2019, it said that AI will transform patient-generated data into clinically useful information and empower patients to manage their own health or seek appropriate health support. And you said that patient benefit should be the driving force behind AI, with new products co-developed with patients from design to implementation. Is that still your view? And would you make a comment on how it's happened in practice since you wrote those words?
Thank you very much. It is very much still my view. As a matter of fact, while I do think that drug discovery is a very important aspect of our healthcare, I think even better is if we are never getting sick, if we can prevent disease, if we can identify disease early such that maybe we don't need to be treated or we need to be treated minimally. So I think as a potential patient, I still that this is very important. I think it should be at the forefront of any technology in AI. And I think, in my opinion, too much is focused on treating disease rather than using AI to prevent disease, to make sure that we identify early disease. And if a patient develops a particular disease, gets at the right time, the right intervention, in the right location, and according to their wishes.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before I turn to Christian, I noticed that Professor Fernandez-Reyes was nodding during what you said there. Perhaps you might just add a comment.
Yes, certainly agree. A focus towards preventative medicine is seriously important, okay? Because that is certainly reduces costs significantly across the public health and preventative medicine. I kind of a comment of what we were saying about the training of clinicians into the domain. Before, which is very important, which has been happening over 20 something years. Of MRC has been focusing on that. In fact, I am a product of that because I'm a trained computer scientist too. Nice. I specialize in machine learning, so I'm not just a medic. So in that area, so there is a two-way avenue in that way. So it's not only we need to train clinicians into understanding, but as well the machine learning, the machine people with technology into what is the domain specific characteristics.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Chair. To Professor van der Schaar, obviously you suggested two distinct AI categories, obviously the Petri dish and reality-centric. Obviously it's looking at both of them, it would appear that the reality-centric is more suited to medical research. Could you explain why, but also could you think of any circumstances why the Petri dish approach would be more appropriate?
So thank you.
Would you just mind for people tuning in that may be unfamiliar with those terms, just to explain them?
Yeah, thank you very much. So as a matter of fact, it's relatively recently that I coined these two terms, partially because of concern with the way in which the machine learning and the AI community to which I appertain is going. So I see reality-centric AI as AI that can operate effectively, accountably, and reliably in the real world, and which focuses on problems which are human-centric and messy. I liked when a previous member of your panel referred to humans being imperfect and messy. So it is very much focused on that. And this is, I would say, the core of AI for healthcare, AI for education, AI for business. And that's as opposed to what I call Petri dish AI, which is very much focused on developing AI technology for playing games, or for that matter, even for solving technological problems, scientific problems that are very well defined, such as, for instance, protein folding. This is wonderful, and I think it needs to continue. But really, the world is not a game, a board of chess, or even of Go, because the reality is in these settings that we operate under complete information. Everything is known. The rules of the games are very well predefined. And the reality of the world, if we take something like the NHS, it is a complex, messy, data, I would say often the environment is changing according to rules we cannot not really predict. Events such pandemics happen. Data is not the more the better, so I can play billions of games of Go and learn the game. I cannot reorganize the NHS billions of times. So I've written this piece to concentrate the minds of my community, the artificial intelligence community, but I would say more generally the world, to not only focus on this, let's say, hyped areas of solving games, but also to focus on really solving problems that are there in the real world, such as problems that NHS encounters due to, for instance, limited resources or complexities such as this pandemic.
So a Petri dish, just to be clear, that it's a kind of protected artificial environment as opposed to the real messy world.
And also very well defined and very clear. So for instance, determining proteins, for instance, and protein folding, it's a very clear, complex, important, but very well defined problem. While if it is for me to develop AI to improve the performance of the NHS and to empower clinicians in the NHS, that's a much less clearly defined problem, but I would say even more important and even more exciting. And I would like my community to focus much more on these real world problems and not just focus on very niche areas.
So before I turn back to Christian, Professor Fernandez-Reyes was very keen to come in on this.
Let me focus this, because I disagree in some of the comments that colleagues say here. So let's focus on the word uncertainty. Okay? Uncertainty is actually very linked to governance, because in ways you want to govern is because you want to create trust and trustworthiness of a technique or one approach. One of the things that the machine learning and the artificial intelligence academia and other researchers in industry have tackled is precisely that, with probabilistic approaches, which precisely they are very successful on tackling uncertainty of a system. Despite they have done it because of games and using the famous AlphaGo of Google and the others, the important part of that is that with that frameworks we can tackle precisely uncertainty. So that field is important because of that. Now we need to extrapolate that into put into a governance framework, those characteristics of these systems. In fact, it's not trivial. So the things we do with protein folding is actually a very complex system. And it's actually very uncertain. Okay, and those I will not call that Petri dish. I would say that actually they are not solved, but they are actually giving a tool which can augment humans to tackle uncertainty. Now we need to kind of govern over it for our prosperity in healthcare and other areas.
Please allow me to intervene just 1 second to say that this is not just about uncertainty. I'm not saying that these problems are not difficult to solve. You have a large state space that you need to solve when you solve protein folding or you play Go. What I'm saying here is that it's not about just uncertainty. It's about modeling very complex, messy systems that have humans in them. And simple games of Go or even complex problems like protein folding do not capture the complexity of the real world like we have in transportation systems and the NHS. It is to this point that I made this point of difference.
I wonder if I could ask both to just kind of raise your voices a little. Although you've got microphones in front of you, that's for broadcasting rather than in the room. So it's a long way between you and us. But Christian.
Thank you, Chair. Also to Professor van der Schaar. So obviously the Centre aims to advance the regulation, safety, privacy and ethical standards within AI and machine learning. How's the progress of this so far and why is it so important?
I think it is extremely important to make sure, especially for AI in healthcare, AI for criminal justice, AI for education, that we build very careful, transparent, and ethical AI. And in that regard, the committee discussed some very important questions earlier, because we cannot build high-quality AI unless we have high-quality data. And unfortunately, high-quality data requires dealing with a lot of biases, a lot of noise, a lot of errors. And again, it is not just having a lot of data. We need to have the right data, because otherwise all sorts of issues and biases are going to be actually propagated. I think, in my opinion, not enough energy is spent on really developing technology, inclusively AI technology, to improve the quality, the representation, and the biases in the data. So that is, I think, something that is at the forefront of my research, but I wish more people would worry about not only building analytics, but making sure that the data on which they build these analytics indeed is of the right quality. At the level of algorithms, I think it is, again, very, very important to make sure not only that these algorithms are working well at the population level, but also are working well in minority groups, and that we really audit these algorithms for not only global performance, but also individual performance.
It's almost like you're saying the data is messy. To Professor Fernandez-Reyes, also considering your background both as a biomedical scientist and a medical doctor, can you explain the benefits of AI to both fields of work?
Of course, so I'm a computer scientist too. So the benefits are many, okay? So in terms of what we've been talking before, so it helps us, most of these techniques, which are diverse in their own right, okay? There is not just a single AI thing, which has been evolved over 30 years with 3 waves of it. At the current moment, in the last decade, it has helped us to understand, for example, complexity of phenomena, especially in biological systems. In my case, I focused on understanding the pathology of malaria in children, why some children go to develop severe anemia that needs transfusion. That is a very complex disease. It has many factors, from the population to the child genetics and all that components of the actual infectious agent. So in a way, some part of these techniques or these paradigms have allowed us to take the data, as our previous evidence speaker, take very complex data into ways we can actually make sense, find patterns in the data. So these patterns might be important. Once we got patterns, we can reverse back, and it's a very difficult phenomena in the sense that you go to a reductionist path. You form hypotheses. I just give you an idea. So when we talk about omics, we work in 3 dimensions, more what we see. You start adding variables, that becomes like a cube of many points, and we cannot imagine. It's very complex. So these have been very useful, these techniques, over the periods of these decades to identify patterns. And then you can go back to the lab, find patterns, and find these famous called biomarkers. How can I simplify this in a biomarker that allows us to stratify risk? For example, what the previous speaker was saying is precisely the way how we stratify patients will benefit for this drug or the risk. So that is one of the part of it. The second part is, how do I deal with that? What do I do with it? Diagnosis is a very complex matter. A human, a medic, trains for 10 years minimum, and it's basically a complex machine associating many things. But it suffers from cognitive tiredness, cognitive load, errors, and biases. It's impossible, not to have a bias. So this thing is actually augment in terms of diagnosis, augment the work of a clinician or a work of a clinical care team, not necessarily, because it's not only the clinician, it's a care team. And the augmentation that provides actually can increase speed up on referrals or, as we were saying, preventing the disease going worse, etc. So this can be another area in which is clear advantages we can put into it. As well, of course, at all the areas that can't translate into a treatment of disease. So in my case, we look for explaining the disease, finding biomarkers, and actually as well using that as a diagnosis preventative. So what can I find those individuals at risk, okay? Of course, that depends, always dependent, context dependent of the disease. The biomedical domain will be like that. So it's not the same. This conversation we have too much is focusing so much on diseases which are characteristic of long-living individuals in a population, cancer, neurodegenerative. Very little is paid attention, for example, in infectious disease. It's a completely different approach, okay? So infectious disease, you need to treat quickly, otherwise, you see the effect quick. And coming all that, the use of that is how you govern this space, okay? Because that's what we, in a way, doing here. So it is true, I can't develop all those things. How can I put these systems that the person who is going to benefit the most of that, which is the clinician, trust that he's going to take a clinical decision that is not going to be legally affecting that person, and the patient, which is going to be trust of that.
Thank you, Chair. I think that actually answers the next question as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's a great question. I think Catherine wants to come in on that.
Just one second, can I chase it? I'll be brief, I promise. So, effectively, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're talking about complexity in systems, and in human and biological systems, that's effectively a bell curve distribution. And if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is you need data that's representative of the entirety of the bell curve. So, I don't know, proteins on the outside of the coat of the Plasmodium falciparum, or MHC complexes within the individual child that's getting malaria or something like that. Are you effectively saying that for it to be effective, you've got to give clinicians confident that the overlay of all of those different distributions of bell curves are within the data to allow the AI to not spit, rubbish out?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because as I say, it's context dependent. Okay? Again, it's not necessarily bell-shaped, okay? You're talking about the distribution of the individuals that generate the states. The data can be multi-dimensional. It can be millions of data points.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And you can choose a characteristic of the data point and might be bell-shaped. Others no. That in a way, that's what these AI techniques are very, very good to do complex models to solve discriminatory patterns. However, it's very difficult to explain. Precisely because I say it's not just as simple as a Gaussian shape. But coming back to the answer to that, it's not the same of AI system I built, for example, for malaria, detecting malaria in, let's say, Nevada, when we have high prevalence of the disease. It's very frequent, it's very common, than one for AI system that I will put in Heathrow to detect which travelers have malaria. Okay, it's a completely different part. So there are techniques in which you can measure that, but it is true that if you, for example, the MHRA has started looking at this in 2022, and one of the high-level topics they say is there is no framework in which...
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of getting at. So from our perspective, we're trying to make sure that this stuff is understood, that it's not producing stuff that's potentially of a lack of benefit. And I'm kind of interested in how you're saying there's got lots of potential, but the data's important, but, protein folding could down to be like quantum effects. How on earth do you put that into...
But it's context dependent as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'm conscious I'm stealing Aaron's...
Right, well, we're going to come back to you, Catherine, but to Aaron, then Catherine, then Graham and Dawn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Catherine. No, it was a great question. You've just talked about opportunities. I wanted to ask you both about the risks. I think Professor Fernandez-Reyes talked about them a little bit already, but from your perspective, Professor Fernandez-Reyes, what are the biggest risks of using AI in medical research?
So I think the biggest risk we have is, first, we don't know what we don't know in the implementation, okay? And of course, the risk we discussed through the session, these risks of not being transparent, the risk of giving explanation that may work, but we don't know how to do it. Safety in the domain is critical. So we say, well, are we creating problems? Are we creating systems which are not safe or therefore robust? Okay? That's one of the key issues at the moment, a key area of research in biomedical medical research and AI systems, which are deep representations. I don't know what protein folded and all that,
Yes.
and on deep models or deep machine learning. Those models actually are very susceptible of small changes and produce a completely different outcome, for example. And that is one of the risks we need to analyze. That boils down to, as the Medicine Regulatory Agency was saying, that we need to create data sets and tools in which I can create guidelines on how do I test this system to be safe, how to test this system is robust. It's not trivial. That requires research in its own right. That requires an interdisciplinary team, stakeholders, which could include data scientists, mathematicians, and other people, including the clinicians and the regulatory agency, to create that toolbox. So I think you could see it clearly. I was happy when I read the October 2020 report. The MHRA has 3 work packages on precisely AI as a medical device.
Yes.
Okay, that is the beginning of the conversation. I think there needs to be resources on that, because the safety framework of biomedicine is there. Okay.
Yep.
Now we need to put this AI as a medical device or a medical framework on top of that. And that's, I think, precisely where these issues of lack of safety, transparency, interpretability, representation, and inclusion, as Mihaela has been saying before, are those issues that need to have a framework in which how do we how do I do compliance to this? So if I come with a new system.
Sure. I'll come to you second, Professor Fernandez-Reyes, because I guess, are these new risks, or are they just evolutions of the risks that are already there, have always been there in medical research?
Well, the safety is always a risk. Okay?
Yes, but also inclusion and bias.
There's been always there, because I give you a very simple example. Children, when they develop, we measure them and we develop and put it in a curve.
Yes.
This curve I developed in the north, for mostly people predominantly living in the north. And myself and colleague Ibadan have to, over the years, create one for sub-Saharan Africa. And it's just recently out because it doesn't exist. And this is just a table, okay, in a piece of paper. I'm not talking about AI. So these problems exist. This problem of sampling, populations, inclusion exists. Now, because, of course, this is large scale now. We go internet, we go globalization. This thing is, the genie is out of the bottle in a way. So it is, the problems are there, but they are actually exponentially bigger.
Thank you. And Professor Fernandez-Reyes?
Thank you. So very much, I'm briefly reiterating, explainability, transparency, bias, trustworthiness are all very, very important, and I myself work a lot on them. But I think something that's not enough said is this medicine and healthcare are a human-centric subject.
Right.
And I think one of the dangers is that if we do not think carefully and we do not regulate carefully technology, we will build methods which are considering the patient as a square. We will make the wrong abstractions about what patients need, the complexity of the patients, and the complexity of the healthcare. So that's the reason, again, I'm going back to this reality-centric agenda, because I really want to see the human, the patient, the human, the clinician, at the forefront of that. And one of the dangers, I think, of building AI that aims to be artificial general intelligence is that we forget about humans. I like very much a comment that was made earlier that this needs to be, humans need to be at the forefront of this. And it is them and their needs as a population and as individuals. And I'm concerned to some extent about the lack of emphasis on the human-centric aspects of these technologies.
So how should we as policymakers address that?
I think that what is really important is to make sure that we take a human-centric view rather than profits first or drugs and innovation first. We really need to understand, so for instance, let me a little bit backtrack. There is a lot of discussion about cutting-edge technologies for drug discoveries, and I think that they are very important. But I think machine learning can play an even bigger role to do the dirty work, to be able to improve logistics in the NHS, to be able to identify. So in the pandemic, my group, which was just a professor and 2 students, we joined forces with NHS Digital to predict, to use the first machine learning tools that I think have been used in the entire UK, to predict how many beds do we need, how many ventilators we need, who needs them. So we talk very often about this very lofty AI, and we are going to know everything about the human, which I think is wonderful, but I think we can use AI for logistics, to solve problems of what type of resources we need when, to predict when a particular patient should return. We talk again about drugs and giving people drugs, but the reality is that at times a patient may be at very high risk, and currently AI is very much used of one size fits all, and we can identify which patients should come to be screened, how often, if they have disease, when should they come back, how often should they come back, what are their competing risks associated with it. These are complex, messy issues that I think are very important to be considered, and we forget about them.
So in terms of improving the health of the nation, you would say we should focus much more on systems and diagnosis.
Yeah. And the logistics part of it. And
put some of Amazon's AI into the NHS.
But with the realization that we are not packages,
of course.
The focus is not profit. The focus is really the healthcare of the population, and using this technology as empowerment rather than at creating incentives and markets that may not be there.
Did you want a further comment, Professor?
I agree on most what Mihaela says, it's true. But coming back to you says, we were talking about the Topol report before, but there was a subsequent report as well by the NHSX, in which actually put all this AI and governance in there. So I think it's worth revisiting as well, because the Topol report didn't went into governance and was focusing most on the AI and robotics. But coming back to diagnosis, it's diagnosis, prognosis, and outcomes and prevention, as we saw before. Okay. Of course, treatment, which is the drug discovery part, is a important axis, okay, right? And
it's just
too much exactly. So what we're trying to say is that this is a whole, from the individual is born in a society to its completion of its life cycle, and society is a complex interaction of all these factors. And of course, can I ask a question to the panel? Is that possible, actually? Do you know how many AI systems are currently implemented in the NHS, AI as a device? You know how many? Well, there are not a lot, okay? So just recently, 2022, NICE have evaluated the use of AI systems for diabetic retinopathy, okay? Which is, AI systems are very good at looking at images. So the biggest change, the low-hanging fruit at the moment is medical imaging, okay? And it is different varieties. So diabetic retinopathy, it is a sample. For example, that's a low-hanging fruit that we could assess. NICE has a report on that in 2022. And the other important one, which is coming out soon, is the CT for suspected stroke analysis, automatic analysis of CT scans of individuals suspected stroke.
Yep.
Tremendous potential for a societal change in our society. So those systems are already being evaluated by NICE together, of course, with the regulatory agency. But what we found is that the framework and regulatory agency, despite we already say in 2016 and now, it needs to be regulation, but it needs to be agile. Okay? So, and that comes back to what the previous person was talking about. So regulation must exist, but it's how you be, the complexity is how you be a regulator agile enough to don't stop innovation. What you need to put is, I will say, okay, is to put resources and the knowledge in institutions like the regulatory agency, which we have been, UK regulatory agency, is actually quite mature and good, and put this interdisciplinary expertise in there. I'll give you an example. The person who...
Yes, yeah, just quickly, yes.
So I'll give you an example. So the person before spoke about medicines and trials, but he hasn't told the most important problem they have. Clinical trial methodology is not developed to understand more than 10 variables at a time, okay? When we go with AI, things is crazy, right?
Understood.
But
That's what I remember the bell curves. Yeah, I've got a suggestion I want to test with you.
exactly.
Just then we'll come to you.
So basically, and the clinical trial units in the MRC invested heavily on this. In the clinical trial units now are mature enough to bring the AI component, which is what we call adaptive trials, okay? Trials which are not done in the classical way, but they are adaptive. And there are two new branches of doing trials, which is what is called the umbrella trials and the basket trials. And that comes to the question, personalized medicine, N equals 1. So those trials are the way to do it. But that needs, if we're going to capitalize from the whole thing, because a device needs to a trial, everything, even a logistic system, will need to have an implementation trial. So we need to facilitate the knowledge inside the regulatory and the stakeholders to allow agile regulation.
Thank you.
So just before I turn to Catherine, just on that point, so we need to have a recognition in the regulation of clinical trials of these new opportunities. Are there other jurisdictions in the world that you're aware of where they're already doing this for clinical trials?
So the US, so remember that in terms of what the person was speaking before, the US is very big in cancer research, okay? Yes, the US have a similar approach to us, light touch, okay, in this area, in AI. In fact, they have already approved many AI as a medical devices, etc. We have a light touch. The European Union has a more strict, more less innovative, so it's more hands-on regulation. And my concept, I agree with that regulation must sit in all the areas that Mihaela was talking, transparency, etc. But is to bring that agility to it. And the only way we do that is to train the regulator. So need to put the interdisciplinarity into the regulation, and the pandemic has shown us that very clearly.
Thank you. Professor Fernandez-Reyes.
Yeah, I would like to say again two things. So, as one of the researchers in the UK, and I would dare say internationally, that has done the most research on machine learning for clinical trials and changing clinical trials, done research in this area for a very long time, and collaborate with both people in the United States, where I was a professor for many years, as well as Europe. I think, again, this looking at clinical trials and looking at the many steps of clinical trials and understanding the complexity of it, again, is a complex system problem, because it's about which patients you recruit. Do you recruit the right patients, or do you select only some minority groups that you are testing? And then when the drugs end up being on the market, only certain patients may most benefit. So again, looking at those responses, it's not only about drugs and components and precision medicine, but it is also about the right dose that is given to a particular patient. Currently, also, patients are included in clinical trials that do not have comorbidities. And the reality is most patients that will get this drug will have comorbidities and will be elderly. Also, another very important aspect is after a drug is approved, what happens to this drug afterwards? Is this drug going to have long-term side effects? Is this going to be creating additional comorbidities? So it is really not only, it's about both regulating and improving clinical trials, but also is about the long-term effects and how does particular drug going to be valuable within a particular ecosystem, for instance, the NHS, which is really quite different as the US or European market. So again, this emphasis on the complexity of the end-to-end systems that I think are very important. But I really would like to jump also on the previous discussion. So we hear a lot about how AI is miraculous in radiology and imaging, and I myself have worked in this area for many, many years. But I think there is an even better opportunity, and I want to re-emphasize that, which is using AI to solve logistic problems, to predict what we need, when we need, to be able to help with really the infrastructural aspects of this.
Well, that's come across very clearly from your evidence. It's very useful. Can I turn to Catherine? Otherwise we're going to run out of time, but we may...
Okay. So I just want to make sure that I'm going to translate what is very sophisticated into simple, just to make sure. So you're saying that at the moment, clinical trials, The AI cannot have a load of blokes having HRT tested on them, and if those blokes have also got diabetes, then the AI is going to come out with an answer, but it's going to be absolute nonsense. So she's nodding, you're not. I just want to try and simplify it for normal human beings, roughly. No, sorry, just let me...
Okay, well, briefly.
Right, okay.
Okay.
So, the thing is you guys get it, I'm trying to simplify it, just to give it a for instance that will never happen. But Professor van der Schaar, your reality-centric model is effectively now sitting into two subsets as we hear your evidence. There's almost a novel discovery piece, and then there's an infrastructure, logistics and planning piece. Now, the novel discovery, as well as the medical imaging, is really getting lots of attention at the moment, and I think is impressively. But a regulator's got to understand what's coming out, given all of these complexities we're diving into. So I'm going to say three things, and I want you to just tell me whether they're nonsense. I will.
Out of time.
You need known results, known data sets to go through an AI. Because if you know the answer and the AI isn't coming out with the answer that's known, then there's a problem. You need to test those knowns going through, and then most AIs in novel discovery need to be giving probabilistic scores on results and range estimates to allow for the uncertainty in the data set. If a regulator did that, would it be a good place to start?
Well, it's an oversimplification, but yes, that opens a discussion with the regulator, yes.
Professor van der Schaar?
I would say this is a good place to start, but I do think that more is needed because you really need to look again at subpopulations, and you need to make sure that this is true not only at the population level but also at the subpopulation.
Yeah, that would be in the known results. That's the known results list. Right, okay. Do you want to go on to the future?
Yes, but very briefly.
Right, okay. We've talked a lot about the future and about... let's just speculate. Do you think it's possible for a drug to be discovered entirely by AI? And if it is, how far away in the future is it? Professor van der Schaar?
Again, my emphasis is not so much on just discovering drugs, is making sure that the right drug is given at the right time to the right patient with the right dose. And I think, again, it's too much focus on just the discovery. There are many other complexities to make a drug effective in a population.
Thank you. Professor Fernandez-Reyes.
Yes, so assuming that drug discovery means effective, I will agree with that. It's a whole, that it cannot be done completely by AI. It's not, the AI for doing that doesn't exist.
The AI can say, have a look
narrow
at,
AI.
The AI can say, have a look at this,
Yes,
but the complexity to make sure it's safe in humans is not within an AI
and
system.
useful for humans, not only safe.
Yeah, perfect. Right, I'll stop now, go on. I've got overexcited.
Let me turn to Graham. Well, then you can
Right,
have...
okay. So I want to... I think I'm quite interested in chasing through this screening and diagnosis, this idea that provided you tested the AI to be, with a known, so I am a 47-year-old middle-aged woman who's likely having reduced estrogen or whatever, and you know that I'm probably in that bucket, and you put me through the AI and out pops out, talk to her about HRT. So can you just give us an idea of this kind of screening and diagnosis advances? Because I don't think that AI exists at the moment, does it?
Very much. Thank you very much for that. So we have done research in numerous diseases and across everything from cancer, a variety of cancers, to cystic fibrosis, to Alzheimer, to cardiovascular disease, to endocrinology, to many others. And the reality is that the technology exists today. It's a lot better than the statistical technologies that are currently used in the Q-risk scores that are used in the UK. We have validated this in more than 1 million patients. The trouble with this is that it is not the flashy AI that gets primetime news, but the reality is that the technology is in place, and I really wish that I was not an academic, I was somebody that could translate it to the NHS, but we have worked closely together with NHS Digital to build some of these technologies, but I think that they could be transformative because currently when you go to the clinician, number one, you are tested for maybe 1 or 2 risks, but the reality is at the push of a button you could be tested for many risks.
So you're saying a standard run of blood screens with a genetic set of coding and some basic knowledge about an individual
even maybe without genetics
could spit out I've had a word with them about this.
But genetics are
Definitely.
expensive.
And what is I disagree completely. So what is very interesting here is we think the more data, the better. We need genomics, we need this. No, the reality is that some of these technologies would enable us to tell what's the minimum amount of information we need to know about this particular patient. So we always think wrongly about AI, partially because of wrong narrative. We think we need big data sets, we need genomics, we need expensive tests. No, we do not. For many diseases, we need actually relatively few amount of information about the patient to make a relatively good prediction.
Provided it was a probabilistic,
Definitely.
80% chance maybe have a bit of an atta.
Exactly, and maybe I can increase the risk, the certainty, if I do a particular additional blood test.
Yeah.
Or maybe I would need to, and another important thing is, it's not only one moment in time, you are a history. So as you are evolving through your life, you may end up having, I don't know, an increase in a particular biomarker, you may lose weight, you may increase weight, you may have other diseases being diagnosed. What AI is good at is looking at these trajectories and trajectories of disease to predict risk and competing risk over time.
Let me just simplify that again, and I'll bring in Professor Fernandez-Reyes. So, for example, the classic folklore would have that somebody with cancer will lose weight beforehand, even if they've not presented to a doctor. So what you're saying, in a routine medical checkup, if there is a significant drop from a previously stable weight, that might be enough of a trigger to go for a very simple cancer blood screen. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yes, this is what I mean.
Yeah.
So it is looking at it, and this is again where AI can be very helpful, because as a clinician, I may not remember very well, and I'm not able to integrate across time this information.
Understood. Professor Fernandez-Reyes.
So as I say, we don't choose the patient, what the patient comes in. So that example of I have the AI system is like, the good thing about the human train over 10 years is like, in a ER room, I don't choose who comes to me. I have to be prepared to whatever drops. Of course, there are different things that comes to you because the populations are different. But I think this thing, like what did you describe, is medicine. Medicine knows this. You know, what you think of all over the hundreds of years medicine evolved, that is what the medic does. Okay, put people in a risk, and clinicians, all clinicians over the time, they're very good at saying no.
They're developing their own.
They develop their own tools.
So
what is very difficult is to translate that into an expert system or AI system. So the good only in the current context of AI is, in a way, to summarize it, if you have an overworked GP, which have to be 60 people in 5 minutes, if you can provide a reasonably good enough summary of where that person is going to come in, I need to look in 5 minutes and maybe do a test and change the life. That is what
that's an opportunity.
What Mihaela is translated that, because that clinician is overloaded.
Yeah, very finally, can I just say the bed and pandemic modelling must have been very bleeding edge and was very important at the time, so thank you for that work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, John Butler.
Thank you, Chair. Fascinating discussion just now, and I was very much on board with everything that you were saying in regards to preventative medicine, using AI for that, and precision medicine, and personalised care, which I think we are moving more towards personalised care, and how AI could help with that. And then during your discussion, I thought the risks in regards to insurance companies, for instance, identifying person, using this technology to say, oh, this person's more likely to develop diabetes, so therefore their insurance premium is going to go up. How do we prevent that abuse?
That is fantastic, because I lived in the United States for 18 years, and my mother and my grandmother died young of breast cancer, and I was terrified to do a screening test for BRCA, because I was afraid that if I would end up having it, I would end up not getting treatment. Luckily, I do not have BRCA, but the reality is that I think that here is where regulation is very, very important, because we do not want people not to do tests that may be relevant and identify disease early, both because of the cost to the society and cost to the individual. This is very important. So this is where I feel very pleased and fortunate to be within the UK system that would not allow this differentiation, and this is very much the case in some cases in the United States. Fortunately, with Obamacare, this is not really a problem anymore, even in the UK, in the US. But I think that we want to not prevent people from having insurance and high quality healthcare. We want to encourage them to discover disease early, high risk early, and help them in really personalizing their care given these risks. And we need to realize that risk is not all genetic, and at times certain risks are modifiable.
So, I mean, that's going to take some really stringent regulations and framework to ensure that there's not that abuse, and ethics will come into this so strongly.
I really hope, I agree completely with that. And I think that this is very, very important as a society to realize that we shouldn't prevent certain people who it's not their choice to have a particular mutation or be a particular risk, and we need to really be able to serve these populations as well. But I think that here regulation is very important.
And what does Palantir do? Do you know much about the organisation Palantir? What do they do? What do you feel about the role that they're currently playing in our NHS system? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, so I would like to say I'm quite concerned about that. I really would like to see much more focus, not only on certain applications and certain niche applications, but rather much more this area being open to many more companies, allow for better regulation. And also I would say, from what I saw early on in the pandemic, was too much focused on some areas rather than other areas of AI. And again, I think that we need to think about utilitarian AI that can really has the individual at the forefront and the NHS system at the forefront. So I really would have liked to see more diversities of companies available in this space, not only a few players, and also much more transparent use of why certain commissions are given to certain companies, and make sure that this is really across the board, making sure that the right technology is in place. And at times I'm underwhelmed as a machine learning researcher by seeing what these companies produce in terms of AI. I think it's very limited and not very cutting edge.
Thank you. Dr.
I agree with Mihail on those comments. So that regulation and open competition is actually even good for the industry. But it comes down a lot of it's like a black box of the black box. So our AI system, it's in their own right, they are black boxes, and we have a problem in regulation that. And now you put that in that setting, as you say, you put a black box on the top of that black box, it makes it much difficult. In terms of what you were talking about insurance before, it's already happening, I'm afraid, with the use of these devices. There are insurance that provide cheaper insurance payments if you do activity, okay, and increase with less activity. It's interesting. It's kind of an incentivation approach, but it can have ethical repercussions as well. Just imagine that person. Just suppose the person have a problem with a disease that cannot be active. The premiums are going to be more expensive. Why? So there needs to be interesting regulation on the insurance system, but that is a big task. Big task.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say one more thing. So I'm also of course I'm an academic, but I'm a big believer in open source software. And I think rather than having one company, Palantir, or another company, I think what would be wonderful for the government is to really embrace this type of open source platforms where industry as well as academics are providing this type of technology. Can be inspected by anyone. There is equal barrier to entry for people, and as a community we can build tools that are generally useful. I think too little is done on open source. My own lab, which is a relatively small lab, tries to put as much as we can in open source software that's sufficiently reliable, and we really hope that people take these technologies and build useful platforms for the NHS.
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you. And my last question, Chair, is so you mentioned, which is like very dear to my heart, AI reducing profits and centering on people. Now, do you worry that there will be large organisations and companies that makes a lot of profit from medicines and tablets Do you think they will try and find a way to sabotage this kind of thinking?
Yes, I worry a lot. As a person, I worry a lot. So that's why I kept on saying we shouldn't focus only on drug and drug discovery, and we shouldn't focus only on the industry. We should really focus on the individual as well as the NHS, because I think what we want is to make sure that we improve the healthcare of the population, we give minimum amount of interventions, we give them when it's needed, and I am afraid at times that the data we collect is also biased, and is again not only the data at one point, it's also the data over time as interventions are made. Because the more I intervene in a biased and not okay way, the more data will show this is the right way to go. Because we do not have counterfactuals for what would have happened otherwise. So yes, I do worry about that. I think a lot more research and careful thinking needs to take place there.
We took some evidence of somebody who said, oh, if we think about the bias, we'll never get anything done.
I'm afraid that if we don't think about the bias, we'll get a lot of very bad things done, as clearly the research has shown. I think this is an underappreciated area, and I think a lot more research and thinking needs to come into it, and it's non-trivial, because there is not only bias at the collection point, it's bias in interventions, because certain people get certain types of interventions and others do not. And this is over time. And this is what I meant when I said reality-centric AI. This may not sound cool, but when you play a game of, again, Go or this thing, it's very obvious because the game is played with very clear rules. If I think about folding proteins, the rules, again, are clear. They are physics and biology. But in this case, there are a lot of interlaced factors and incentives that are corrupting the data. So we need to be very careful when we use data where interventions have been made, not to propagate wrong decisions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
I might add that it is true. What I agree with what your comments you were saying. But the pandemic shows us that we do, and we know we cannot do this without industry. So what we need to find is the fair and the proper channels and stakeholders, interdisciplinary stakeholders, to regulate, in which the industry can pay the contribution on the regulation, because manufacturing is a problem, okay? A pandemic has said. So on behalf of the case of manufacturing, it's not only about AI. I can produce any AI thing, but if I can't really produce it, it's not going to be translating benefits anywhere. So we need to find that balance, and industry is important to take on board. It's basically, it is difficult, but we should try. And the bias is nothing new, because medicine is being generated since Hippocrates' time. These biases exist. And most of the evidence-based medicine, in a way or another, is trying to deal with that. Not perfectly, it's impossible perfectly, but it's safety. At the end of the day, the bias will safety that some minority groups will not be represented, and therefore they will suffer on a safety event, for example. Okay? And it is important.
Definitely, I'm also for industry. I'm not saying the industry shouldn't be involved. And I think actually industry is very aware of that. But I think we still need to be careful and make sure that with industry we are thinking carefully about these problems.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Dawn. Just on these questions of biases, which is clearly a very important aspect. One of the things you were talking about is the potential for bias in human intervention. So, clinicians having a fixed preconceived idea as to who's going to benefit, what kind of lifestyles and things might be prioritised. Do you see it possible that the more expansive use of AI may overcome some of those human biases?
Fantastic question. As a matter of fact, this is exactly one of the important areas of research that I do. So I do a lot of work on exactly this particular area. I coined an unhelpful word called quantitative epistemology to allow for that. But
so what was the word again? Say it slowly.
Quantitative epistemology.
Quantitative epistemology.
But the idea is exactly that.
I'll leave you to say it.
So I work a lot with clinicians and exclusively a lot of transplant doctors, both in the United States as well as in Europe and the UK. And we know that, for instance, historically, women have been transplanted much less They were considered to be not strong enough, to be weaker. And this is one of the many examples where I encountered, and it took decades for this bias to be removed. And what we have been building is technology that is trying to look at, so there is some variation in practice that is desirable because we have different ages, different genders, different characteristics. So there's desired variation in practice. But there is also what my clinical colleagues called undesired variation in practice, where biases and maybe wrong judgments are made. And what we are developing together with clinicians in 3 different continents is exactly this type of technology that tries to see what is undesirable bias and try to accelerate the adoption of technologies. And in particular, we have written some recent work where we show that if these technologies that we are building, which are actually quite complex machine learning models, we would have identified probably 10 years earlier from the data that humans could have been transplanted for heart surgery earlier. And I think that these are exciting technologies, so you are right. But it is complex because the data that we have encodes knowledge and expertise and positive biases, but also negative biases. And disentangling the two can only be done by building careful technology in collaboration with human experts and a diversity of human experts.
Very good, that's very clear. John wants to come.
But because that comes from academic environment, that doesn't mean that doesn't need to be regulated. I come back to it, so that is important. So the best example to this, let's make it simple. So just suppose I'm a GP in Chelsea. Next day I have to be, never been, but I've been called to be a GP in Tower Hamlets. That, been 10 years working in Chelsea as a GP, go straight ahead to Tower Hamlets population. That itself as a medic generates a bias. So these AI systems, if they are done nationally, actually internationally, the concept of homogenization in some aspects, can allow that transition to this new clinician in there to say, hey, you were not paying attention to these things because you are by a population set. You can, is again, augmentation of clinical care. So the individual have augmentation, and it's clear that will benefit a lot of different settings because some minorities are representing one setting and no others, okay?
What I want to say there is not so much that we are going to build technology that is going to say, hey, you are biased, and is going to make aware the clinician potentially to debug their own thinking process and more or less to ponder different aspects. Just because we are women doesn't mean necessarily that we are going to be weaker. So just being, let them ponder and showing related examples from related cases locally and internationally, because one of the challenges that we saw was that actually in some centers they were seeing very few subpopulations with certain characteristics, so they didn't have much experience, so they were afraid, for instance, to act, but the overall information throughout the globe existed. So what I'm after is definitely not replacing clinicians, but providing them these tools such that they can ponder different choices that they have and provide them evidence, and then let them, of course, make the final decision together with the patient.
I see. Final word to Dawn.
Just quickly, you mentioned, I think, Dr. Lemera, a black box on top of a black box when we were talking about Palantir, and you mentioned how, and Professor Mela, you mentioned how worried you were that we've put in all of our eggs in one basket with this one company. Just touching up on this bias. In the Palantir black box, that could be full of all kinds of biases that we don't know about, right?
Okay. So that is actually a problem. That's the reason why I think we need to have a lot more open source, such that, and we need, as a country, invest in open source software, such that many different companies and many different groups can inspect this, both data as well as technologies that are built, and we can get stronger together.
It's necessary condition, but not sufficient. So, as the MHRA is already hinting, is we need the tools to deal with that. Because I can make open source the code, but code changes. So there are a lot of technologies we need to implement of this, okay, like layer technologies, etc. And how the system is changeable. Systems are sometimes monolithic, sometimes they are adaptive. So I don't think open source is just solve the problem completely. You can, because when I go and put a drug, for example, let's say, the image array, yes, they see everything, but that drug is not open source. I don't know this. I don't know the source components of the Pfizer vaccine, for example, the nanotechnology, but the regulator knows. Okay, so that is more efficient than me putting the components of that thing open source, because might be condition necessary, but not sufficient to achieve what you say. Because we got open source for many years. Journals thrive on open source, etc.
No, but I think you misunderstand my point. My point is, I think you misunderstand. It's not about. It's about putting the AI software that companies like Palantir and others are using internally and getting, let's say, not scrutinized. What I'm saying is, I would like to see a lot more investment by the government in open source AI software, which can be used as a platform for other companies to build their knowledge on. And it is transparent to everyone and can allow many companies to flourish on top of this platform, rather than putting everything in a company that doesn't share their software.
Very good. Well, listen, we're very grateful for that discussion. The purpose of the inquiry is the future governance of AI, so these questions are very relevant. Very grateful, Professor Baldassar and Professor Fernandez-Reyes, for your evidence today. And that concludes this meeting of the committee. Order.